My lady and my lords, may it please the court, I appear with Dr. Edward Stewart, King's Counsel for the Comptroller-General of Patents. My learned friends, Mr. Chaxfield, King's Counsel, and Mr. Eustace appear for the patent applicant, Emotional Perception AI Limited. As my lady and my lords will understand, this is an appeal from the decision of Sir Anthony Mann, sitting as a judge of the Patents Court. He himself was hearing an appeal from the Comptroller's Hearing Officer in the United Kingdom Intellectual Property Office. This appeal is about the programme for a computer as such exclusion from patentability under Section 1 to subsection C of the Patents Act 1977, and in particular the applicability and application of that exclusion to the branch of artificial intelligence known as artificial neural networks, or ANNs. It also touches on the mathematical method exclusion under Section 1.2, subsection A, to a small extent. And as the court may appreciate, this is the first case in which the relevance of the exclusions to artificial neural networks has gone beyond the UK Intellectual Property Office. And it's common ground that the extent to which the exclusion applies to ANNs, and if so, how, is a matter of some significant public importance, having regard to the proliferation of AI techniques in today's world. Now, in that context, I should make clear from the outset that my client, the Comptroller's interest in this appeal is simply to determine the law and its proper application in this area. The respondent just happens to be the first entity whose patent application brings this new legal point to the courts. And apart from wishing to correctly apply the law, the Comptroller has no interest in whether or not emotional perception or any other applicant is granted or refused a patent. In this regard, I should also make clear that the Comptroller has no agenda in either promoting or resisting the granting of patent protection for AI-based inventions. That is a matter for the legislature, and the Comptroller's interest ends at correctly interpreting and applying the legislature's statutory provisions. Now, subject to my lady and my lords, I'm intending to address the court under 6 separate heads. First, an introduction to the technology, artificial neural networks. Second, the patent application and its claims. And that leads me to my third topic, which is our ground 1, that the judge was wrong to hold that the programme for a computer as such exclusion was not engaged at all. Fourth is our ground 3. If we're wrong about the engagement of the computer programme exclusion, because an ANN does not meaningfully involve a computer programme, as the judge found, and my learned friends maintain, then we say my learned friends have to address the mathematical method exclusion under Section 1, 2, subsection A. Fifth, the law on the application of the exclusions, be they computer programme or mathematical method, if either or both are engaged by an artificial neural network enabled invention. And then finally, our ground 6, that the judge was wrong in applying that law to find that the claimed invention in this specific case involves a substantive technical contribution that avoids the exceptions. Now, as we understand it, having regard to paragraph 5 of my learned friend's skeleton, the respondent doesn't seek to hold the Comptroller to what the judge below interpreted to be a concession. That procedural point is the subject of my ground 2, and I'll pick up the relevant material from this in our discussion of the technology, but I don't need to deal with any procedural point that the Comptroller made a concession which binds him on this appeal.
And I can see that agreement is indicated. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I'm grateful, my lady. Likewise, given the way in which my learned friends put their response, it doesn't appear that my learned friends take any procedural point on my ability to raise the mathematical method as such under our ground 3. And I think my learned friends confirming.
But I'm pleased to see that too.
Yeah, my lady, just to clarify, because this is a question which is of importance both to my client in this application, but also more generally in my client's broader portfolio and industry wider. What we're keen to avoid is it being suggested that the decision that falls from this court has been decided on an inappropriate concession or the like. So we are not taking procedural points, so that obviously we do engage with the substance of those matters.
Well, we're grateful to you for that. Thank you.
I'm grateful likewise. That moves me to my first topic, which is to introduce the technology, artificial neural networks. And I can pick this up in our skeleton, starting at paragraph 5. And although the theory behind artificial intelligence has been around for decades, as the court will no doubt appreciate, it's become something of a technology front-runner in recent years. Collectively, AI techniques are so named because they're at least loosely modelled on the apparent intelligence demonstrated in the natural world. And artificial neural networks, ANNs, are an important subset of AI, and it's the AI technique which is specifically engaged on this appeal. And for present purposes, I can pick up the judge's summary of the technology at paragraph 15 of the judgment, which is in the core bundle, at tab 7.
Did you say paragraph 50?
15, 1-5, my lady.
Thank you. Page 90. No, 89.
Page 89.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as the judge explains, based on the evidence before him, an ANN consists of layers of neurons, which are somewhat akin to the neurons in the brain. And the judge explains that the neurons are arranged in layers and connected to each other, or at least to some others, and the layers below. And we can helpfully find a diagrammatic depiction of that actually in the patent application, which is at sub 7. Pass that over to my unit. Thank you. Supplemental bundle, tab 7, page 131. And depicted in the left-hand dotted box is a single artificial neuron. And as explained by the judge, it's capable of processing inputs and producing an output which is passed on to other neurons in other layers. And in this figure, we have inputs x1, x2, and x3 going down to xr. And these feed into a summing function, 730, depicted by a summation sign. And note that the corresponding lines include so-called weights, the WI1, WI2, WI3, and so on, for each corresponding input. And the summation block adds up the weighted inputs such that the output from the summation block is called here, helpfully, AI. It's the A output for the ith artificial neuron. So the output from the summing function is x1 times wi1, x2 wi2, and so on. Also added into the summing function is what we call the bias. It's a constant signal calculated by multiplying the number 1 by the special weight b sub I, which we see at the bottom of the summing block. And it's the sum of the weighted inputs and the bias for the ith neuron, AI, which is fed into what we call a nonlinear activation function, F, shown here as 734. Now, there are different types of known activation functions, but typically they're nonlinear functions, such as a continuous sigmoid function, a kind of S shape. Now, the output from the ith neuron is here depicted Y sub I, and is calculated by multiplying AI by the nonlinear function to give us the output. Now, as shown in the figure, this is just one neuron in the entire artificial neural network. The network itself is arranged into layers, starting with the input layer, which is depicted on the left-hand side, where we have inputs I1 through to IN. And each of the outputs here are depicted by 3 neurons, O1 to OM. And in between them, there are interconnected layers. So we move from the neurons at the input into a number of hidden layers. Here 2 are depicted, and then finally to the output layer. And for my lady and my lord's notes, the description of figure 2 is on pages 43 to 44 of the patent application. That's 176 or 177 of the bundle. Now, although we can depict the ANN as we do here in the small example shown in this figure 6, practical neural networks tend to involve a lot more neurons. And the example given in the patent application at page 177 is that they have at least 2 hidden layers, so that's 4 layers in total, with 512 neurons in the first hidden layer and 1,024 neurons in the second hidden layer. So they're a lot bigger than we'll see in this typical diagram. The patent application itself also tells us that the activation function they're using is something called a ReLU function, a rectified linear unit, which is has a particular shape to it. Now, just standing back, an ANN consists typically, therefore, of hundreds to thousands of generic artificial neurons, arranged generically into multiple layers and forming a generic structure from the inputs to the outputs. And although this is all generic, the computer scientists can choose how many neurons in how many layers and select the specific activation function that they wish to use. But we still only have a generic neural network. What we have also seen is that each individual neuron has its own individual weights and biases. They're different for each neuron in the configuration, or at least can be so. In it, we say it is the complete set of weights and biases that are set to make the ANN perform a particular task, be it recognizing a person's face, or detecting handwritten letters, or deciding simply whether it's day or night. Mathematically, by setting specific values of all the weights and biases in the neural network, an almost arbitrarily complex mathematical function can be set between the inputs and the outputs. And my lords and my lady may note that in fact in a standard neural node as shown on figure 6, there is a significant similarity to the well-known straight line equation y equals mx plus c. Just taking the input, first input, it's wx plus b. And if one gets into the detail of how neural networks really work, is they create a whole series of delimiting lines in multi-dimensional space. And the idea is to build a box or a plane that surrounds the data of one classification from the data of another classification. Now, how complex the function is depends primarily upon the number of neurons and the number of hidden layers. So how does one go about setting the weights and the biases to make the ANN do a particular job? And the judge picks this up in the judgment at paragraph 16, quoting from Professor Pardo. The process is called training. And as the judge explains, this requires a training data set, a validation data set, and a loss or cost function. And to explain, the most important thing about the training data set is that we have both the input data and we have to have the desired answer, we have to know what we want the neural network to actually be telling us. So if I take a very simple example, if I want to train a neural network to recognize the handwritten word yes from any other handwritten word, I need lots of examples of the word yes in lots of different people's handwriting and lots of examples of words that aren't yes, of other words. Big stack of pieces of paper. Some of them have got yes written on, some haven't. And of course, for this simple example, I already know what the answer is. I'm perfectly capable of looking at my example sets and dividing them into piles, those that are yes and those that are something or another else. And I can also define a very simple cost function. If the word is yes, I want the neural network to give me the answer 1. And if the word is anything else, I want the neural network to give me the answer 0. And armed with my training set, I can then train the neural network. I present each word to the inputs of the neural network and see what output I get. And the first time I do it, I'm not expecting to get a 1 for a yes or a 0 for a no, for any other word. But I'll get some number between 0 and 1. And the difference between the number I get and the desired or target number is said to be the error. That's my loss or cost function output. And a mathematical process can then be used to make small proportional changes to all the weights and biases in the network to minimize the error term. A well-known adjustment algorithm referred to by the judge is called backpropagation, which, like its name suggests, starts at the output with the calculated error and pushes the error backwards through the neural network from the output to the input, adjusting the weights and biases at each stage so as to reduce the error at the output. And having done that for one example piece of handwriting, I then move on to the next example in my training data set, and I do the same thing. And I repeat this again and again, perhaps hundreds or thousands of times, until the little changes that are made on each backpropagation cause the neural network to start to apparently learn what output to give me when it sees the word yes presented at the input, and what answer to give when it sees some other word. And because these little incremental changes are made for every training example presented, and is made incrementally, if I go through my entire training data set once, making changes at each stage, I can then go through the training data set again, because the second time the network sees my first example, it's been changed from when it last saw the first example. And I can expect to continue making improvements. Now, periodically, as the judge noted, the progress of training can be tested using what we call the validation data set. This is a separate set of examples to the ones we're using for training. And the idea is that the validation set can be presented to see how well the network is performing. But we don't make any changes when we use the validation set because we want to keep it as a test which hasn't been sullied by the training process itself. The idea is that when the network has been sufficiently trained using the training set, when we present the validation set, we ought to get the right answers, in at least the majority of the cases. And as the judge explains at paragraph 17 of the judgment, once validation has proved that the training is deemed to be complete, the neural network is frozen and can be used for real data rather than simply the training process. Now, at this point, we don't know what the answer to the question is. The idea is that we should be able to take brand new handwritten words in my example that the ANN has never seen before and present them to the neural network and get the right answer at the output. Was it a yes or was it some other word? This part of the life of the neural network is known as the inference stage. It's where the neural network is no longer training, but it is inferring its output from what it has been trained to recognise. And just to be clear, there's no actual intelligence as such in the neural network. What we have created is a very complex mathematical function between the inputs and the outputs. The function itself is entirely deterministic once the network has been frozen. The network will always do the same thing when it's given the same input. But it's capable of generalizing from the data which it has been shown in training to infer what the right answer is for new data which it has never seen before. Now, what's the difference between the generic untrained ANN and the trained ANN? Very simply, it is the set of all of the weights and biases which have been determined by the learning process. It is that set of weights and biases which instructs the generic ANN to give the desired outputs for the desired inputs. In my example, to make the ANN determine the difference between yes and any other word. If I'd chosen to train the ANN to recognise the word no instead, the weights and biases would have been a different set. And moreover, it is this set of weights and biases which can be used to duplicate the neural network as many times as we like. If we want to make hundreds, thousands, or even millions of copies of our handwriting detector, we don't have to train each and every one separately. We have already determined the sets of weights and biases that make the generic ANN perform the function we want. So we can build as many generic ANNs as we like, and then simply load each one with the predetermined set of weights and biases. And voila, each ANN will perform exactly like the one we trained in the laboratory. And that's why an ANN-assisted self-driving car, to take another example, can come off the production line preloaded with the sets and weights and biases that make it immediately able to do its job. Those weights and biases were determined once by the car manufacturer going through a training phase, but once done, they can be loaded into as many copy products as we desire without further training. And they will all do the same thing in the same circumstances. What we don't have to do, to state perhaps the obvious at this stage, is to send each self-driving car off to a driving school after it's been manufactured to learn how to drive. It doesn't need to learn at all. It's simply preloaded with the weights and biases on the production line. And then it will drive as well or as badly as any other car coming off the same production line. Now, furthermore, should the car manufacturer continue his or her development, improving training in the laboratory, refining perhaps the training data sets used or the algorithms used for adjusting the weights and biases, to make a better algorithm, the improved set of weights and biases can be made available to existing customers as an upgrade, perhaps next time they put their car in for service. All that has to be done is to reprogram the weights and biases in each neural network to the new improved set worked out by the car manufacturer in its laboratory. And the point that I'm building up to make is that once we get to the trained ANN, we have two separate things. The first is the generic ANN itself. And second is the set of weights and biases that make the generic neural network do a particular thing, be it recognizing handwriting or steering a car or detecting a face. The generic ANN, however implemented, is a data processor. It takes inputs, mathematically manipulates the data down through the layers and calculates the outputs.
Sorry, you were just going slightly too fast.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's a data processor. It takes the inputs and then...
Mathematically manipulates the input data through the layers and calculates the output. And the comptroller's position is that the generic ANN is itself a form of computer. Indeed, the Collins English Dictionary defines a computer as a device, usually electronic, that processes data according to a set of instructions. The digital computer stores data in discrete units and performs arithmetical and logic operations at a very high speed.
Rather than read it out, could you give us a copy in due course?
Pardon? They were left in chambers, I'm afraid, my lord.
Don't worry,
but
overnight will do.
I will bring them forward. The definitions, all, and I'll hand them up for my lord and my lady to look at. They all emphasise the input, data processing, output functions of a computer. The Collins English Dictionary actually express that different forms of computers exist. It gives examples of digital, analog, and hybrid. And we all know that even within the digital computers, there are 8-bit computers, 32-bit computers, parallel computing architectures. And as we move on into the far future, or perhaps the near future, different architectures such as quantum computing. They're all computers, they just have different architectures. And we accept entirely that the ANN architecture that we're talking about, such as that in figure 6 of the patent application, differs from that of a conventional digital computer, but it is still a computer. It takes inputs, performs calculations, and generates outputs which are being calculated. So turning now to the question of a program. What is a program for a computer, or as we often call it, simply a computer program? And here I can be of more assistance, my lady and my lords, because hopefully these made it into the judgment below at core 7, page 98. And we have here a set of instructions that make a computer do a particular thing, a set of instructions for a computer to perform some task, a set of instructions stored inside a computer that allows the user to do a particular thing, for example, produce a document, play a game. What these definitions have in common is that they're a set of instructions that make a generic computer perform a particular task. And we say that's exactly what the set of weights and biases does in an artificial neural network. It is the set of instructions which make the generic computer do a particular thing. One set of weights and biases makes our neural network detect the word yes, another set to detect the word no, and another set to self-drive a car. A new program, if I call it that, can be loaded into our car at the next service to improve the way that the self-driving car goes about its business. Just like any other computer system can be updated to perform better or add a further feature. And we picked up this categorization initially at paragraph 7 of our skeleton, cross-referring to paragraph 59 and following. And the real detail of it comes at the real detail of it comes in paragraph 63 on page 46 of the bundle, where we set out what we say at 63.1 a hardware ANN is, at 62 the program for an ANN is. And whilst we're in this section, it's perhaps helpful to explain some further aspects to which it may be necessary to refer. And these are in my sub 3, 4 and 5 on internal page 20, bundle page 47. Now first at 3, as we've noted from the judgments, paragraph 18, as well as specialist ANN hardware implementing the neurons and the layers, it's possible to emulate the structure and computation of a neural network on a conventional computer. In effect, the conventional computer runs another piece of software which enables a more conventional computer to emulate the hardware of an ANN. Now, as we explain here, we agree with the judge that where there's an emulated ANN, there are two programs. The generic software which emulates the ANN hardware, and then the set of weights and biases which constitute the ANN program itself, just as in a hardware neural network. At point 4, we point out that during the training stage of a neural network, there's an additional piece of software. This software or program is what presents the training data, calculates the error or cost function, and then incrementally changes the sets of weights and biases according to some known algorithm, such as the backpropagation algorithm, which we discussed. As we've pointed out in our skeleton with reference to the judgment of paragraph 25, the training algorithm, the data set, the cost function, and all the other necessary configurations are chosen by the person seeking to train or program the neural network. My learned friend avoids calling that person the programmer, but he does call them a computer scientist, and that's his paragraph 17 at the top of 58 in the bundle. And then finally, at 5, my sub 5 on page 47, we point out that it can't make a difference to the proper categorization between computer and computer program if the program for the ANN is hard-coded. And what we mean by this is that in some applications, and we give the hypothetical examples of a dishwasher or a toaster, the program is sometimes permanently set at the time of manufacture, rather than being reloadable or upgradable. And we say it has never been suggested in the field of the computer program exceptions that a microprocessor permanently programmed to operate a dishwasher should be treated any differently to a microprocessor carrying the same program, but which can be upgraded by loading an improved or modified program. The essence of the program is that it instructs the generic hardware to perform a particular task, not that it can be changed at will. And the fact that some systems we can upgrade the program simply helps us to understand what the different parts of the system are doing. That's my reason for talking about the upgradable situations. Now, over at paragraph 64 on page 48 of our skeleton, we therefore summarise the comptroller's position as to what the technology is that we're dealing with. All neural networks are computers, whether hardware or software, emulated. All ANNs in their inference stage, that's after we finish training them and we're using them, have a program, and it's a set of weights and biases. For emulated neural networks, there's additional generic software for emulating the neural network on a conventional computer. And then finally, in the training stage, there's additional software and additional program to perform the training function itself. Now, I accept before the judge that we didn't say what I've just sought to explain, perhaps with the clarity that I've at least sought to give in our skeleton and before my lady and my lords now. And this led to an issue as to whether or not the comptroller had made what the judge below described as a concession in the case of hardware neural networks. And we sought to clarify the position on appeal, and as my lady and my lords have already established, My learned friends have taken the very sensible line of not seeking to prevent any withdrawal of a concession, if that's what indeed it was.
And indeed, you've set out in your skeleton exactly what your position is.
Exactly.
Yes.
And I should note that my learned friends say at the end of their paragraph 5, where they're saying I can withdraw any concession that was made, that his client nevertheless says that the original concession was in fact rightly made, and my client's reverse position on this appeal is artificial and wrong. So although my learned friend says I can argue the point again, he doesn't agree with what I've set out in my skeleton and sought to explain to my lady and my lords this afternoon. Now, as we understand it, what my learned friends are saying is that a trained hardware implemented neural network has no computer program.
Just before we get into the detail, can I just look at this from a procedural angle? And this is a question that, although I'm addressing it to you because you're speaking, is more a matter for Mr. Chacksfield in due course. But as I understand it, it is common ground that the claim embraces both a hardware ANN and a software emulated ANN. I do not understand it to be in dispute that the claim is bad if it includes something which is excluded under section 1 subsection 2. So if we assume that the result of the argument on this appeal is, let us take a hypothesis, that a hardware ANN is not within the exclusion, but a software emulated ANN is, then the claim is bad because it includes that which is excluded. Now, as I understand it, there is no subsidiary claim for which the applicant contends which is limited to a hardware ANN. If one asks oneself why not, it's not hard to guess why not, namely, it wouldn't be of much commercial interest to them. The commercial interest is likely to be in the software emulated ANNs, or at any rate with a claim that is not limited to hardware. And therefore, it seems to me the net result is actually that all of this question about hardware ANNs is a distraction, because it's no use to the applicant to wind up with a claim that's limited to hardware ANNs. So we can just focus on the software ones. Now, as I say, that's probably for him to answer in due course, but is there anything that I've said so far that you think is erroneous?
No, my lord. What your lordship has said is absolutely right. That is, I'm trying to avoid it, but that is part of the backstory of where the confusion arose below, because what was being said in the context of the hardware was then extrapolated backwards by the judge to software. I think perhaps I'm misunderstanding the substance, not form authorities here, that where in the past, take for example Gale's application, the patentee had, or the patent applicant had a computer program and tried to claim it as a computer programmed with the program and said, aha, there's hardware. And the courts have long said, well, look, it's substance over form, and it doesn't matter that you just take the software and put it into hardware. And what I think became the confusion down below was going the other way, saying if sometimes you can find a hardware ANN, that means that it doesn't matter if you implement them in software. But my Lord Justice Arnold's summary of the position as we see it and the relationship with a claim which undoubtedly covers both the software and the hardware is bad if the software ANN is wholly excluded subject matter, even if there's some get out in the position of hardware. My Lord, unless I can assist further with that, what we understand my learned friend to be saying is that the hardware nevertheless has no computer program. And we find this in my learned friend's skeleton at sort of paragraphs 11 to 18 under their technical background section. I'll return to it when we get to our ground one, but in essence, my learned friend's point, as we understand it, is that an ANN doesn't use a conventional sequential programming language. Indeed, at paragraph 16 of my learned friend's skeleton, they explain, albeit in the context of the software ANN, but having made the point in 15 that they don't see any practical difference between software and hardware, my learned friends say the computer program takes the form of serial, logical, if-then type statements defined by the human programmer, and which define exactly what it is that the program computer does. An ANN, however, doesn't rely upon a series of instructions of that type, but instead is an emulated machine supported on a software platform. And as we understand the argument, the contention is that a neural network is not a computer and there is no program because there is not a series of instructions of the logical if-then type. Now, we agree that the architecture and program of a neural network are different to those of a sequential digital computer that my learned friends appear to have in mind. But as we shall see, there's no reason to limit the statute in the way my learned friends implicitly suggest, that it only covers a specific type of computer architecture. And notably, my learned friends don't say that the analysis set out in our skeleton as to what is the computer and what is the program for a neural network, which I've just been through, they don't say it's incorrect. They just say it doesn't have an if-then type instruction set.
For what it's worth, I can probably see things that you can't. Yeah. I can see shaking of head. All right, so I wouldn't make too many assumptions.
I'm grateful, my lady. I try to ignore the
it's quite all right.
From the side.
It's just sitting here, one does see quite a lot.
I'm grateful, my lady.
Mr. Wilkinson, can I just deal with one point? Is there any magic in the word instruction? Because you have used it in the context of these weights and biases, and I just wonder whether that's the best word to use. You say it's information which will cause the machine to do what it does. Whether it's really an instruction probably doesn't matter very much.
I don't have any I'm not particularly wedded in any way to the use of the word instruction. The point that we make is one can understand how one says one instructs the machine to do something. Yes. But in either case, whether we're talking about a conventional program where we are loading code, or whether we're loading weights and biases, it's the thing that we're loading that causes or instructs the computer to do the thing. So my lord is right to say, does it have any special meaning? From my perspective, I say absolutely not. You've got to stand back and look at what's actually taking place. Now, before I leave the technical background, I just want to pick up something that also comes out from my learned friend's skeleton around paragraph 17. A slightly different but related point as to who the programmer is in relation to a neural network. Now, my learned friends seem to say that in relation to a conventional computer program, the programmer is able to solve some problems because they can conceive of the logical set of methodical steps required to solve the problem, and then can code those steps using the if-then type statements that my learned friend has in mind. My learned friend says that, in contrast, the sort of problems to which neural networks are deployed are intractable to computer programming, by which they mean conventional if-then type statements. And to be clear, whilst we agree that neural networks are especially suitable for solving intractable problems, they're not limited to solving only such problems. But more importantly, my learned friends make clear that there's still an important role for the computer scientists, who they identify at the top of page 58 of their skeleton, to do. It's 58 in the bundle. Internally, it's page 5. So it's the continuation of paragraph 17, and then we pick up 4 lines from the end of the paragraph. But even then, the computer scientist does not know in advance what the structure of the ANNs will adopt, and so on. I mean, put simply, an unskilled member of the public can't generally pick up a neural network and reliably train it to do some task. Training a neural network requires a computer scientist who understands how they work, understand the training and the validation sets needed, understands how to select the appropriate numbers of neurons and layers, the type of activation functions that are appropriate, and then the conditioning of the input and output data structures. This is all programming activity. Done properly, the computer scientist will find that his or her neural network trains properly and works well with data that it has not previously encountered. Done badly, and the neural network will either not work at all or produce poor outputs. It is also true that the ultimate weights and biases are generated predominantly by the training process under the operation of training software, and are not normally typed in directly by what my learned friends call the computer scientists. I mean, my learned friends are absolutely right in this, but it's exactly what happens these days in most conventional computer programming. The programmer makes the necessary arrangements, be they in a high-level language such as C, or by dragging boxes around the screen in many of the visual programming languages, or designing an app for a phone. Once the programmer has done whatever they need to do for the setup, they push the button and another piece of software, often called either a compiler or an app generator or something of that nature, processes their setup and pops out the machine code which actually causes the computer to operate. No one realistically sits down and makes machine code directly, and most programmers would find it very difficult to understand the machine code in a modern computer. It's exactly the same with the neural network. The computer scientist, or we would say programmer, chooses all the necessary aspects of the setup and pushes the train button, at which point some other software, here the training software, processes what the programmer has set up, and eventually out pops the set of instructions which cause the neural network computer to operate. And that's the set of weights and biases. You can dip into those weights and biases and better understand what they individually do, just as you can by having a peek at the machine code. It's just very difficult, and most programmers either wouldn't know how to do it or would struggle with understanding precisely what was going on. And notably, when we're talking talking about a programmer using some sort of visual programming tool, or a programmer setting up a neural network, the result which is ultimately run on the computer is itself a computer-generated work. And borrowing from the words of section 9.3 of the Copyright Act, concerning the author of a computer-generated work, the author is the person by whom the arrangements necessary for the creation of the work are undertaken. And we say that's the same whether we're talking about a person who sets up a conventional computer program or a person who sets up a neural network. What that person has to set up is different in each case, and for that matter, from programming language to programming language, even in conventional computing. But it's still putting in place what's necessary to generate the ultimate code, which causes the computer to perform a particular task. And the reason I make that point is it picks up what my learned friends say at the end of their paragraph 36. And although we don't necessarily agree with it, what my learned friend seeks to say is that the purpose of the exclusion under section 1.2 in respect of computer programs is to prevent overlap with copyright.
Well, the Travo don't bear that out.
As I say, my lord, we don't necessarily agree with my learned friend, but if that's the point you want to make.
Historically, in the early 1970s, there were roughly 3 schools of thought. One, that computer software should be protected by copyright. 2, that it should be protected by patents. And 3, that it should have sui generis protection. And there was no consensus. And you certainly don't find that from the Travo to the EPC 1973.
And my lord, that's why I say I don't necessarily agree. I was avoiding saying I don't agree with my learned friend. But as far as he wants to make this point, the point I'm making is he hasn't got a distinction between what's going on in an ANN programming and what goes on in conventional computer programming, even though that's what he's trying to generate and the point he's seeking to make in his paragraph 36.
I can't find it in his paragraph 36.
That probably means my reference is wrong.
I think you mean 34?
Yes, it's 34 and it's at the end.
And I don't think that what he says there about Lord Justice Jacob is accurate either. He refers to that as being a possibility, if my memory serves me correctly.
Indeed, my understanding of what Lord Justice Jacob is saying in Aerotel about the origin and the collective nature of these various rights is we don't really know. They've all come from so many different places, trying to find a statutory interpretation, a policy that the exclusions are seeking to give effect to is actually not possible. So again, I have some issue with the end of my learned friend's 34. But my lady and my lords, that brings me to the end of my introduction to the technical background, including what we say a neural network is, why the comptroller says the trained neural network is a program computer, and how the additional training program and emulation software fit into the overall story. And unless my lady or my lords have any further questions, I was intending to move on to discuss the patent application and its principal claim. I'm grateful. So the patent application, this is in supplemental bundle tab 7, and the latest version of the claims is in supplemental tab 8. For my lady's benefit, this patent application is in the course of prosecution before the office, and it's quite normal that during the course of prosecution, in order to seek to resolve objections between the office and the applicant, new sets of claims are generated. So we actually have the original filed claims that are towards the back of tab 7, but on separate sheets. It's tab 8. We've got the current set of claims as they've reached in prosecution.
Thank
Now,
you.
as my lady and my lords will have no doubt seen, the document itself is quite long, but as I will explain, there isn't actually a dispute between the parties about what the patent application teaches, at least on the bits that matter, such that we don't need to go through it in a huge amount of detail. And in paragraph 12 of our skeleton, we have set out the agreed inventive concept of the application. This was originally characterised as such by the applicant before the hearing officer. It was set out by the judge at paragraph 24 of the judgment, noting that we didn't dispute it below. We still don't dispute it, so that is actually agreed. We're all agreed, but I ask rhetorically, agreed to what? The inventive concept is, from my perspective, somewhat impenetrable without at least a little bit of context. And I intend to look at that first and then come back to both the inventive concept as summarised by the judge and also the principal claims. Now, as I say, the patent application is in tab 7 of the supplemental bundle. It takes its filing from 3rd of April 2019 and is titled Method of Training a Neural Network to Reflect Emotional Perception and Related System Method for Categorising and Finding Associated Content. Now, we can get an overview of what the applicant is really trying to do from figure 8 of the application, which is on page 133 of the bundle. So on page 133 of the bundle, we have a diagram, and right in the middle, the sort of blobby shape, is a representation of a network, a computer network, typified by the internet, marked 902. Now, connected to this are user devices, which are illustrated by a desktop computer 906 at the bottom and a smartphone 908 over on the right-hand side. And of course, this is exemplary only. Other types of user terminal, like iPads or whatever, can also be used. At the top, and also connected to the network, is the source database 306, which holds relevant information. Now, the application is broad in terms of the variety of information to which the teaching is said to be able to be put. But the most typical illustration given is audio files for music. And indeed, my learned friends highlights the size of the global music streaming industry in the very first sentence of their appeal skeleton. And it's certainly convenient to use music streaming as a reference application when discussing the patent application itself. And I'm content to follow my learned friend's lead and to do so. Now, the screen illustrated on the mobile phone 908 has got its own little number, 930, and it's said to represent a graphical user interface, or GUI. And the specification says that it provides access to searching tool software application that permits searching for tracks. And by tracks, it's talking about music tracks. And the invention, the database, user interface and internet, without the invention, the database, user interface and internet network connection thus provide a conventional music streaming system. The idea is that a user can search for and select tracks stored in the database somewhere off in the cloud, and then retrieve them over the internet and play them on their local device. And of course, the extent to which the searching is possible depends on how well the database is catalogued and whether or not the user is presented with useful functions, such as, you've just listened to this, you might like to listen to this other track. Obviously, whether they're available depends on whether or not they've been provided by the service provider. And one example given in the patent application as being known in the prior art is that the service provider can collect information about different listeners and use that to make suggestions. Something along the lines of, people who listen to the track you're listening to went on to listen to this other track. Would you like to listen to it too? And what the patent application is seeking to do is to improve the quality of these sorts of suggestions for a new track. And a number of points are made as to the problems with the existing system, including that they make it difficult for new artists to break into the market with new material. This is what the applicant calls the cold start problem. In short, if no one or almost no one has ever downloaded the new material or material from a new artist, it's difficult for it to be recommended based on its popularity to other listeners, so new artists never get started, the cold start problem. And that's described in the patent on page 137 of the bundle, lines 15 onwards. And another point made is that similarities between tracks are not always straightforward. And the example my learned friends like to use, and they make it, for example, paragraph 21 of their skeleton, is that existing systems categorize heavily by genre. So as they put it, hard rock they, my learned friends, put it, hard rock playlists beget hard rock songs, even if there might be a musically very similar song in a different genre. And the example they give as being similar to hard rock is Wagner. So the patentee is trying to improve the future recommendations approach in systems such as the music streaming industry. Now, going back to figure 8, the additional components added to the system to implement the invention are the server with system intelligence at 904, which has itself a lookup table consisting of 2 columns, 920 and 922. And the idea of the system is that every track listed in the source database, which is at the top, 306, is represented by an entry in the first column of that table, 920 track. Each also has an index, in fact a vector called the V file, which categorizes the nature of the track, or as the applicant calls it, the semantics of the track. And the V file vector locates the track somewhere in multi-dimensional space.
What is it, a vector?
I think
I've never understood, because a vector
think,
to me connects 2 points and you've only got 1.
I think it's a vector quantity in the sense of it's not scalar. So it has X, Y, Z.
Multiple dimensions.
Multiple dimensions. That's as I understand it.
So it could be 2 numbers. It can't be 1 number like a scalar. It has to be 2 numbers.
Exactly. It's a vector. It's something that locates you in this multi-dimensional space.
Which I would have called a point. Defined by all dimensions in that multi-dimensional space. But that's what the word vector is referring to. You tell. I don't know.
Your lordship is right. I work with the language that the applicant is using.
Okay.
I mean, sometimes these points are looked at in the sense of if you assume that the point is referenced to a 0, 0, 0 origin.
Well, I wondered about that.
The coordinates are both a vector quantity and a vector itself. It's just the other point is implicit. There's simply a reference point at the origin or something of that nature. But the idea is
we can understand. Is it 2 things? We can understand that this vector relates only to 1 track, and it characterizes the track in some way by more than 1 number.
Yes. Locating
Those are the 2 things we need to
They're the 2 things you need to know. I'm grateful, my lord. Now, as I say, the idea is the tracks are located individually. Those that are in similar places in multi-dimensional space should have similar V-file vectors, and those files are desired to have similar music qualities. Now, as such, when a user wants a new track, the V-file vector of the current track can be determined if it isn't already known, and the user can then be offered tracks which have nearby close V-file vectors. And it's said that this will provide improved file recommendations. And one can see, taking the patentee's exemplary problems, that it's easy to see that the cold start problem with new artists and new material potentially now doesn't arise, because the recommendations for the next track depend upon similarity to the current track and not historic numbers of previous downloads. Likewise, whether useful or not, and assuming that Wagner is indeed musically similar to hard rock, one can see how the classic FM listener might find themselves being introduced to hard rock, because the vector positions are in similar point in space.
That might cheer up some Saturday mornings.
Indeed, Mann, indeed.
And I don't think it's in dispute that that question is an aesthetic question. So what results from this clever system is something that is designed to give satisfaction in the realm of aesthetics.
That is certainly my client's position. We describe it as having a subjective quality because it's subjectively as to the aesthetics. I think my learned friend quibbles with the application of the law to subjective contributions.
Well,
but I don't think he actually...
With respect, this is why I raised the question, because I read what you said about subjective, and that didn't seem to me to be entirely helpful, because it wasn't referenced to the statutory language. The statutory language that seems to me to be relevant are, first of all, aesthetic creation, secondly, performance of a mental act, and thirdly, presentation of information. Now, as I understand the applicant's argument at the moment, they acknowledge that the result of the system is something that lies within those domains. It's aesthetic. It's in terms of a recommendation. It's a mental act, and it's presented to you in the form of a list, which is a presentation of information. But what they say is that doesn't matter because we've got a very clever way of producing this recommendation based on the pairwise system of training, the ANN, whereby you force the semantic pair to converge with the physical pair.
Yes.
Just to help you, Mr. Nicholson, and I'm using help in a technical sense of not help you, I don't really agree with what my learned friend just put to you. Just, I don't want you to think that what was put to you is common ground from the bench. And just to tease it out a little bit,
Yes.
Speaking for myself, while, of course, some of the properties defined in this way are things which human beings would regard as aesthetic, so for example, the volume of the loudness of a track, it's there in those numbers as I understand it, because the machine has measured how loud it is and written it down, and that's what's in the file, is the volume. And that volume, of course, people perceive in an aesthetic sense, but I don't see it, for speaking for myself, that that's an aesthetic thing in the relevant sense in the context of exclusions from patentability. And as I understand, I think I'm right at least to this extent, that the number is there because it's come from something measuring the loudness of a track. And where that goes in the end, we're not there yet. And just to finish that, as I understand it, the semantic content, again, although it might use words which human beings would recognise as having some aesthetic quality, they're there because they've been read by a computer reading text files of what people have written, as I understand it. And if I've got that wrong, do tell me.
No. Yes, I'll come back to the point about the individual points of the vector having a meaning, because there are embodiments, I wasn't actually intending to spend a lot of time on, there are embodiments where separate processing of individual components are taken, and the vector is a concatenation of the individual points, but that isn't the system that's being claimed. The system that's being claimed is in much more general terms. Yeah. So I'll describe the general and then I'll come back specifically on that point, my lord. So just going back to figure 8, in very broad terms, what the applicant is aiming to do, we've seen, to give these better file recommendations. But what matters is how he goes about doing it. How are the V-file vectors generated and how are they determined? And we can actually pick this up at figure 7 on page 132, the preceding page. And this is a flow chart showing how the selection part of the process we've just been looking at works. To be clear, this is when the system is set up and running and the users already are able to download and load tracks. This is how the new recommendation is made. And we start up at 802, where we select a track. That's actually the file the user is now listening to. And the flowchart assumes we don't already know the V-file vector for this file, so we have to determine it. And that happens in boxes 804, 806, and 808. And at 804, we do something called feature extraction to produce descriptors. And this is something I skipped over when introducing neural networks. We talked about the inputs to the neural networks, but we didn't talk about how you take something like an audio track or an image file and condition it to form the inputs of the neural network. This is a data manipulation and conditioning process, which is known as feature extraction, and the techniques for which are well known to those involved in neural networks. And it doesn't matter, but examples which might apply to a music track are things such as calculating the beats per minute or converting the time file into a frequency file, such as that shown in figure 4 of the application. And the output from feature extraction are ways of looking at the music file itself to find useful inputs to a neural network, and we call those descriptors. So going back to figure 7, at 8:04, we've sort of pre-processed the music file and pulled out some descriptors.
And as I understand it, that's what the application calls the property space. So this is, as you said, BPM, timbre, volume, those are all objective physical characteristics of the file.
Something that you can measure in the music file using conventional techniques and form up to provide inputs to the neural network rather than just simply providing it with a long series of time samples that the neural net doesn't know what to do with. So back in figure 7, we then take those descriptors or the results from those descriptions for the particular track, and we process them through the neural network. Here it's called a neural network, no difference to an artificial neural network. And we know it's a trained neural network because we're told it's a neural network with optimized weights. And out the bottom of the neural network pops the V file. And it's actually, as sometimes these flowcharts are drawn, it's drawn as a separate box 808, generate the vector V file. But it's actually what's come out of the neural network from the previous step. There's nothing more to generate. And then just picking up to complete the process, at 810, we compare the vector V file with the stored vectors, they're the ones in column 922 in figure 8, to identify close semantic files or tracks based on vector comparisons. And then we can list at least some of those files in descending order of semantic closeness and provide them to the user. Now, the V file is actually used in at two different times in the overall system. One is the way we've just looked at it, where we have the music file the user's listening to, and we need to get its V file vector, and that's figure 7. And the second is to form the V file column of the table in figure 8, which involves performing all of the steps 802 through to 808 to push the whole source database of tracks one at a time through the neural network to generate the V file vector for each track so that it can be stored in the second column of the table in figure 8. And in fact, as I hinted at earlier, it does seem somewhat unlikely that the full figure 7 use would ever actually be used, because if the user is listening to a particular track which it got out of the database, it's highly likely that the system knows that it is in the table on figure 8 and it's already got the V file number, so it doesn't actually need recalculating, but that's just for completeness of understanding. But what I now need to turn to is how this neural network is trained to produce these V file vectors. And we can pick this up by reference to figure 3 on page 128. And we've already discussed how neural networks are trained using training sets with cost functions and an algorithm such as backpropagation to adjust the weights and biases. And that's the same process which is used in the patent application, but there are a couple of points of specific detail some of which my Lord Justice Arnold has already mentioned, which are, because they end up being reflected in the claims. So I'll start with it in a slightly more detail. Everything starts with the training data. And my lady and my lords will recall that for a training data set, not only do we need to know the inputs, we also need to know the target output, the answer, because that's what we're going to use to back propagate an error term. And sticking with the music file example, the training data that the applicant starts with, each bit of it has two things. Firstly, it has the music track file itself. And secondly, what my Lord Justice Arnold referred to as the property, or the aiming for the property space. And secondly, what the applicant calls a semantic description of the music track file. Now, the semantic description is something which has to be written by a person to describe the music track. And it might be very simple, say, for example, Madonna, Holiday, 80s, dance pop. 4 simple points to it. And of course, more detailed descriptions are also possible. And no doubt, the more information, the better the system will potentially be. But the semantic description isn't, however, anything numerical. It's not a V-file vector. It can't be used directly as the answer for training a neural network. And to get around this, the applicant teaches using an off-the-shelf natural language processing engine, or NLP, and to operate it on pairs of files at the same time.
Mr. Nicholson, why, taking that, if that's true, I'm not saying I don't mean if that's true because I don't agree with it, why does that not apply to the other piece, the music track file? What is it about the music track file that you can use to train the ANN, which you can't use the semantic data for?
The issue with the semantic, you could possibly train directly for semantics, but I've started with the application, and the application, the way it works in practice, uses these V-file vectors, and probably a more accurate way of putting what I just put, my lord, is that the semantic description, my Madonna, Holiday, 80s, dance pop, isn't a V-file vector. It isn't something that you could load into that table on figure 8. What the patentee wants instead is a multi-dimensional numerical vector that has some sort of semantic equivalent. Now, it may be that you could have used artist as a direct vector quantity and arranged alphabetically, and maybe you could even force your neural network to recognise and learn the word Madonna from the time. But that's not the way the patentee goes about
What I thought was going on, but now I'm concerned I haven't understood it, is that the first stage involved doing, as my lord pointed out, the property, by which I think we all understand it means, I will say physical property, beats per minute say, and creating some kind of trained neural network using the physical property. I thought that was what it explained.
No, the claims,
right,
the claim system. There's a
and then taking what you've done and then playing with the semantic.
So there's a raft of embodiments within the scope of the application, but the one that's ended up in the claim has a neural network that simply works with this V-file quantity and doesn't try to separate it down separately into beats per minute and the like, and it compares it directly with the semantic space. If I continue to the description, okay, hopefully your lordship will see where this all comes together. So
sorry, just okay, yeah. But in that case, you need to explain to me the V-file quantity you're talking about in this context is something to do with the properties, so-called.
It is the V-file that ends up in figure 8.
Not the one that ends up, the one at the big. Sorry. what I thought you just said, and again, forgive me if I don't want to mischaracterise what you said, is that you perform this training function that you're about to explain to us using the semantic thing as a result of the natural language processing. You perform that given as a starting point a V file of some kind.
It's my fault. Let me start again. You want to train the neural network to generate this V file quantity. Now, the way in which you train the V file quantity, what defines the V file, because the network just learns what you show it. Where does the V file quantity come from in the first place? It comes from the semantic descriptions.
Okay.
And what the patent applicant teaches is that you form the V file by doing natural language processing on the description between pairs of files, and then subtract them, find the difference between them, which tells you how close the semantic descriptions of the two files are. And then you want the neural network to be able to learn the same thing. But when the neural network in the application operates, it doesn't work on pairs of files. It needs to be able to work on single files. So it's quite a complex process in how you train using pairs and end up with a neural network that works singularly. Perhaps, my lord, if we could just go through it step by step,
I'll keep quiet.
and then I'll come back and see if I've made it sufficiently clear. So the natural language processing engine, or NLP, operates on pairs of files at a time, and that's in page 141, 14 to 23. And it's also explained as being a well-known technique in the expert report, paragraph 51 in S9, page 219. Now, NLP's natural language processing is another technology sometimes grouped under artificial intelligence. But it's the concept of taking expressions written by humans in natural language and processing those written descriptions into some sort of meaningful vector space system. And what the patentee does is to put the semantic description, say Madonna Holiday 80s dance pop, through an NLP engine to generate a vector somewhere in multi-dimensional space of all English language descriptions. Now, we don't need to get into NLP engines, but the idea is that the 2 points described by vectors in semantic space will be close if the 2 English language descriptions used to produce their vectors are close. So taking my example, wherever Madonna Holiday 80s dance pop ends up, we can expect it to have a vector which is relatively close to Madonna Material Girl, our 80s dance pop, and very distant from Beethoven Symphony 5, 1800s classical. And the thing to pick up is the applicant doesn't, however, treat the output from the NLP engine as the answer or target for training the ANN. Instead, the applicant teaches training using pairs of files at a time. And it seems that this is because the applicant is really interested not in the closeness of semantic descriptions per se, or in the whole universe of possible English language expressions, but rather in the closest of the much smaller universe of semantic descriptions of music tracks. And to do this, the patentee trains using pairs of tracks at a time and treats the desired answer as the distance in semantic space between the NLP vectors of the 2 tracks. And a consequence of this...
Sorry, just run that one again. It is the distance in semantic space
between the NLP vectors for the 2 tracks. And the consequence of this training in pairs is that the applicant's most basic system for each training loop uses 2 music files and 2 corresponding semantic descriptions at a time. The pair of semantic descriptors are separately processed by identical NLP engines, and then the difference between the resultant vectors in semantic space is calculated. And the pair of music files is separately processed by 2 identical ANA engines, with the difference between the resultant output vectors also being calculated. And the error or loss function is generated by comparing the NLP vector difference with the neural network vector difference. And this error term is then propagated. Yeah.
Forgive me, I'm really sorry. You say comparing the difference between the NLP vector difference, and then you said the ANN vector difference. I think you mean, but if you don't, I'm really confused. When you say comparing with the ANN, you mean the property ANN vector difference?
Yes, basically, there's extracted...
A physical property ANN. No?
No. Should we look at it in the diagram to make this clear? So let's start on figure 3 on 128. So actually I'm going to, given having listened to my Lord Justice Birss, I just want you ask me to put something out of your mind first. If you turn to figure 2 first, I think what my Lord Justice Birss has in mind here we see 2 tracks, 302 and 304 coming in. We have feature extraction, and then we've got a multitude of different ANNs. The one on the left is the rhythm 310, NNR rhythm ANN. Then we've got the tone ANN 312. Then we've got the timbre ANN 314, and they all generate different vector components which are then concatenated together at 350 and 352. Now that is a very specific embodiment. It isn't the generality. And I think there's a lot of the confusion is arising from this sub-example. So if I could just ask your Lordship to bear with me and pop that out of your mind for a moment. And just assume with me that the V-file vector is an aggregate vector that's trying to place similarities somewhere in property space.
In property space or in semantic space?
In both. The whole point of the system is that you use natural language processing to find a place in semantic space, and then you train the neural network so that points that are close in semantic space are close in property space, so that then you can throw the semantics away, run the music tracks through the algorithm, and find out which files are close to each other in, not just on the basis of their beats per minute or their timbre or their rhythm, but those files that were semantically close to each other are now categorized by the neural network as being semantically close to each other, even though the only thing that the neural network has got to work with is the music file itself. Does that make sense to my Lord?
Well, that's what I thought was going on, but you seem to have been saying something completely different for the last 10 minutes, and it's my fault, no doubt.
No, let me try to walk through the flowchart and see whether we can make this clear. This is the training process.
What's this? Figure 2?
Figure 3, my Lord. So I've moved on from figure 2. I was asking your Lordship to put figure 2 out of your mind. Forget about having multiple ANNs, some for rhythm, timbre, and everything else. We've just got one ANN that we're using for this system. We select the track or data file of 402. We do feature extraction to get a whole load of audio descriptors. Doesn't matter how. We then apply,
And what are these? Semantic?
no, these are actual, they're coming physically from the music file.
Right.
Yeah, so those are the BPM, etc.
Or whatever it is you've chosen to
Yeah,
use.
the BPM is an example.
Then we apply those to parallel neural networks for pairs of tracks. So whatever we do, even if we only use one neural network at this stage that has multiple inputs where we feed our various descriptions, the important thing is that we have one for track number 1 and one for track number 2. That allows us to generate vectors from each neural network. And then, importantly, we want to determine the distance between the output vectors for the two neural networks. So we've got one neural network that's tried to tell me where we are in space for track number 1, and an identical neural network that's processed the data for track number 2, and it has tried to tell us where we are in property spaces. And what we're interested in is the distance between the two of them. And why are we interested in the distance between the two of them? Because we've used the NLP engine to compare our natural language semantics and see the descriptor, the English language descriptor for file number 1 and the English language descriptor for file number 2.
Sorry, Mr. Nicola, I'm really sorry. Figure 3, starting at the top where it says start,
Yeah.
select track, data file, so there's an audio track. Then it says apply NN, yes, audio descriptors, and you agreed with my lord and myself that an example of that descriptor could be beats per minute. It might not be beats per minute, but it's one of those property things, a physical thing.
Yes.
Then it says apply NNN weights. So this is still now working with the BPM, beats per minute. Generate multiple composite vectors. We're still working with beats per minute. Determine property distance between NN output vectors. As I understand it, we're still working with beats per minute. But you, when you got us to 410, started talking about semantics.
Well, semantics comes in at 412.
Well, I agree,
and then
but that's not where we're yes.
So
and then we get onto the back propagation at 422.
Yeah. So the point, my lord and I are in agreement. But the bit that I just want to point out for you that's really important and absolutely at the heart of this, at 406, you have to do this for pairs of tracks.
Yes, we're doing this with pairs of tracks on beats per minute.
Yeah. So if you take beats per minute as the example, yes.
Yes.
So then we take of our two files at 410, we determine the property distance between the neural network output vectors. So
Yes, you've got a distance in terms of beats per minute between the two files.
or something that we fed beats per minute at the top.
Yeah.
The number that we've got coming out of the bottom has been derived from beats per minute.
Yeah.
But if the neural network has done anything, it's no longer beats per minute.
No, sure, but it's done it
It's
from-
an arbitrary reference.
But so far at 410, semantics have not come into it.
No. Now,
Then something else happens involving the semantics.
now, at 412, what we're in at 412, a lot takes place because here we've done the semantic space vectors, which are discussed elsewhere in the application.
Yeah, and that they're not shown in figure 3 because the natural language processing that produces the semantic vectors is done elsewhere.
I'm grateful, my lord, exactly. But what really happens, and this is the really important thing then, is 418. Because here, the semantic assessment will say that Madonna Holiday is very similar to Madonna Material Girl. And what we want to see, having put the music file through the neural network twice, is that the neural network's comparison of output results tells me that these files are very close together. Or, if I've put Madonna and Beethoven in, the semantic engine tells me these files are very far apart. I want to have the neural network tell me that these files are very far apart. So I do the comparison at 418. And if I'm getting the right answer, if the neural network comparison whatever that number-based system is now, whatever the vectors are they've all fallen away. But whatever the number that's coming out the bottom of the neural network is, does it agree that these files are close together or far apart according to whatever the metrics coming out of semantics? If it is, we don't do anything. If it isn't, then we go into back propagation, as my Lord Justice Arnold said at 422, where we force the error back through the neural networks so that next time we run the data through, we expect to get a closer match between the semantic space and the property space.
And do we do that? Are we doing that to the distance in semantic space or in property space?
We do it in property space because it's the neural network in property space that we are training. The semantic space always comes out of this off-the-shelf NLP engine. It always produces, it gives us a number, so we train the ANNs in the music space, in the property space. Yep. Now, when we've gone through either whether we've made back propagation corrections or not, we go on the C link back up to the top right-hand side, and we see whether we've exhausted the training set. If we haven't exhausted the training set, we go round with the next file, and we keep going round and round and round, perhaps hundreds or thousands of times. When we've finished, we drop out the bottom of the decision diagram 414. And then for each track in the library, it's quite badly expressed, but for each track or file, generating a Euclidean vector from optimized neural network weights. What that means is you take, with respect to our figure 8, you take for each of the files in the source database, you push it through the final version of the trained neural network, and you store the track ID against the generated Euclidean vector relation. So that's the V file number.
What you end up with, as I understand it, is a V file, which is different from the one you would have created if you just used the properties, the BPMs and the timbre and everything else, where, for the sake of argument, the first entry in the file, which I know it won't be as simple as this, but let's say was the one mostly affected by beats per minute, would have been perhaps a big number to represent a big difference, because these two tracks had different beats per minute. But in the result of doing what we've just done, it might be a much smaller number to bring them closer together because of the fact that in the semantic space both tracks were by Madonna, and so you've adjusted the difference between files given their physical properties like beats per minute or timbre to make files which are not physically necessarily particularly close to each other to bring them closer together because of what was found by reading the semantics using the natural language processor.
Your Lordship is right, but you only start to see how it works when actually you remove the simple example of just beats per minute. Sure. And you actually say there's all sorts of different metrics.
Well, also your example of the semantic space is not how I understand it, because that's based on genre. It's actually based on, is this happy, is this sad, stuff like that.
Again, there's the pattern application leaves it very broad as to what the semantics is, but my Lordship is absolutely right that the semantic description...
Right, you could use it for genre, but the idea is it would
to break away from genre, exactly.
Yes.
So what we're trying to do, ultimately, is to end up with things that we can measure coming from the music file, which goes through the neural network, and the neural network produces an output which would, if the human who was sat down writing the semantic description was categorizing these, would be saying similar things about them. They're close together in the vector space from the neural network.
But it's not as simple as a neural network simply based on the semantic space, because it isn't just, if you could do that without doing half of what's on this in this application. You could just process the semantic information with a natural language processor, bang it through an ANN, and you could say that two tracks which made somebody happy were close together. The point is, as I understand it, that it's they will say cleverer than that. Doesn't matter whether it's clever or not. But what happens is you have two tracks which do have physical properties in common in some aggregated way, the beats per minute and and the timbre and everything else, that makes them a bit closer together, but they're also brought more close than they might otherwise have been because of their semantics.
The only thing that sets the error condition for the training of the neural network,
Which one?
is there is only one neural network.
There are two. There's the one that does the property space, and you start off, there's the property one, and there's the semantic one. And then you use the distances in the semantic space to adjust the properties of the neural network, which is the property
No,
space.
my lord, the difference in the semantic space comes from the off-the-shelf natural language processing engine.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Which
Which you don't change.
Which you don't change.
Yes.
That generates, it takes the pairs of expressions in and says how close, based on this semantic description, purely on the textual description, how close are these files together? And that result, we then force train into the neural network. It's the only error metric. You may not be able to get the timbre or the rhythm or any of those inputs to the network, but they may go entirely in the process.
Yeah.
Because what you're training it to do is that when I give a file to the property space neural network, it generates a vector point in space that has semantic relevance, and it's only the semantic relevance it's interested in, because that's the only thing at that stage which is used to train the neural network that is working on the music file, the property neural network.
But as I understand it, when you use the semantic information to train the neural network, it's not a naive neural network that you're training. It's a neural network which already has in it property distance between the files. Isn't that right?
No.
No, okay, I have misunderstood then.
It starts as a completely normal, generic network, a neural network. The feature extraction is done to work out whether or not I'm putting frequency information or beat information, whatever, in. That's a non-neural network process. And then the neural network is trained in the same way. And that's why I took my Lord Justice Birss to figure 2 and said there's a separate teaching where they say, as part of this exercise, rather than teaching one network, you could subdivide this into a rhythm neural network, a timbre neural network, a tone neural network, and then concatenate the vectors at the end. Or you can just replace these three separate ones with one big neural network that you put the feature extractions into. So you've got three things coming out of the feature extraction. That could all go into one combined neural network. Go at the bottom. And the reason I'm interested in the one neural network is because that's the one that ends up in the claim. This figure 2 embodiment, which uses three neural networks in parallel, which have been ascribed to separate real-world features, isn't the principal embodiment of the claim.
But sorry, I think the point you're making, Mr. Nicholson, is that the semantic distance, which comes, as I understand it, from a neural network, isn't one that anyone ever changes. That semantic NLP distance, no one changes it.
Nobody
What's changing is the neural network, which started off as being based on the property distance.
Yes. And when you first started that very first piece of training data, you started with a completely blank neural network. The first result you got out was rubbish, and you made some improvements to the weights, and you went round and round and round and round the training data set, just like you do with any other neural network. And then at the end of the day, you end up with a neural network where I can put any music track in, and it will give me this vector V file, which lines up with all the other V files I've collected, which will tell me where, by direct comparison in the vector, where vectors are close together, these tracks should be semantically similar. And when they are far apart, these music files should be semantically different. And the reason that you want to do it is that you can now categorize any music track without having a human sit down and write that semantic description. Because the only thing you need the semantic description for is the training set where you need to know the answer, and then you train the neural
Because
network.
you identify the track by its property, not by its semantics.
So in effect,
Mr. Nichols, that's been helpful, but I'm looking at the clock. It's not your fault. You've had a lot of questions from us, but you haven't even got to ground one of your appeal yet.
so I'll take this. Yeah, just let me pick up. So, with that in mind, with some intrepidation, I go to my skeleton at paragraph 12. My only reason for going through the detail of the specification is so that we can understand what the agreed inventive concept is and the agreed claim construction. So the inventive concept is at 12, and as far as it's different, the claim is at 10. So if we just go through 12 together, and I'm hopeful that we will be ad idem.
I thought you told the court this was agreed.
It is, but what I wanted my lady and my lords to understand is actually what the words mean, and that's why I was trying to look at the patent application. So I'm not changing it, I just want to go through it together to make sure we are ad idem. That the invention of the application is a neural network-based system for providing improved file recommendations. We've seen that. The invention may be hardware or software implemented, yes. The fundamental insight is that the training of the neural network, which analyzes the physical properties of the file by pairwise comparisons of training files. The pairwise comparisons, in these pairwise comparisons, the distance in property space, so that's the music file space, between the output or property vectors of the neural network is converged, is trained, that means, is converged to reflect the differences in semantic space between the semantic vectors of each pair of files. And the semantic vectors come from the NLP processing of the semantic descriptions, I add. The result is that the trained neural network, singular, files clustered closer together in property space, that's musical recording space, will in fact have similar semantic characteristics, as those far apart in property space will have dissimilar semantic characteristics. Once trained, the neural network can then be used to identify swiftly and accurately files from a database which corresponds semantically to a target file, and to provide swiftly and accurately file recommendations to a user device. So the idea is there reflected in how I've described figure 8. And going through the process I've sought to describe with respect to the specification. And one does have to be careful not to get caught up in embodiments where there are multiple neural networks. That's not the key inventive concept. And then very similar, I don't think I need to go through it separately, but claim 4, there was separately agreed and accepted a construction of claim 4 at paragraph 10, which my lady and my lords have there. Just quickly picking up a few things from my notes to move on. Down below, everyone looked at claim 4. We continue to look at claim 4. My learned friends suggested it might be necessary to look at claim 1, but it's not entirely clear as to why.
Well, it also gets you into an entirely separate problem, which is whether it's justified to have a product by process claim. So it's much nicer to avoid that problem by concentrating on the method claim.
I'm minded to. I will concentrate on the method claim. If my learned friend wants to open up claim 1, that's a matter for him, and I'll come back in reply. There was one thing I just wanted to show you on the claim itself, which is in sub tab 8. Just on claim 4, there's an odd nomenclature typo that at lines 23, there's a B in a back propagation. This is page 203. We have a B in back propagation. We also have a B at 27, storing in a database. By comparison with the other claims, I'm putting it all together because A is all about training the ANN, and back propagating is part of the training AAN process. I think the correct way to read it is to delete the B at line 23, and then it all comes back together.
The or the B?
The B. If my lord looks at line 4, we have A, training the network. Then at line 23, you have...
Which page are you on?
Page 203.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, my fault. What happens if I go quickly?
Page 203. Well,
203,
yeah.
looking at claim 4, my lord will see that A, at line 4, there's training.
Oh, I see.
At 23, there's B in back propagation. And then at 27, I think it is, there's a B story. The one that needs to be deleted is just the B marker at line 23. So A is all the training.
Yeah, we've got it. Shall we move to ground one?
Now, whether or not the exclusion is engaged in the sense used by the judge, meaning do we need to consider it in detail, we say isn't a complicated point, and not one which gives rise, in fact, to any proper dispute as to the law. As we've discussed in the present case, Claim 4 and Claim 1 as well are each to computer-implemented methods comprising data analysis and information retrieval, which involves processing data within a computer or computer network. The whole of the claim is this data retrieval process, and it's all entirely within a computer or a computer network. The hearing officer summarised it as a prima facie claim to a computer program.
And we have read that decision.
I'm grateful, my lady. Now, the issue arises because the applicant asserts that as a matter of technical fact, a neural network is not a computer and doesn't involve a computer program. And if that were right, then the claim as a whole would not be to a computer program, and the exclusion wouldn't arise. And we agree with that legal analysis, at least in respect to the computer program exclusion. It's the factual analysis where the judge has fallen into error. And why this point is of a special concern to the comptroller is that if my learned friends and the judge are right, and a neural network is not a computer and therefore doesn't involve a program for a computer, it necessarily follows that any claim in any patent application to an invention including a neural network will bypass the computer program exclusion entirely. Now, it is this point that a claim involving neural networks does not involve a computer program and therefore doesn't even engage the exclusion, which has given rise to assertion by numerous third parties in the press that there's been a substantial change to the United Kingdom's interpretation of the EPC and a material departure from the approach of the EPO and other EPC jurisdictions in respect of artificial intelligence. And we've given a quote of one such article at the end of our skeleton. I mean, given the nature of the point on our ground 1, somewhat strangely, my learned friend's skeleton, at paragraphs 95 to 97, specifically seeking to assess our ground. Rather than a discussion of the facts, there's instead many allegations that our skeleton wrongly muddles up concepts of the invention and the invented concept of the claim and wrongly deconstructs the claim with citations to well-known authorities to give the impression that our ground 1 is a point of law and that we've got all of the law wrong. Now, we don't accept the criticisms, but none of them properly go to ground 1 at all. Ground 1 is simply that the judge was wrong to find that the exclusion was not engaged at all by the claim, because he was wrong that the neural network part of the claim doesn't involve a program for a computer. Now, we can see the judge's finding in core tab 7. On page 103, where on the basis of his understanding of the technology and his understanding of what the comptroller was conceding, the judge, 2 lines from the end of paragraph 61, says that as a matter of construction, the claim is not to a computer program at all, and the exclusion is not invoked. And the point is simply a question of correctly characterising the technology of neural networks. If the comptroller is right, and a neural network is simply a particular form of computer program, the exclusion is engaged, or invoked as the judge put it, and to avoid the exclusion, my learned friends then have to look elsewhere in the claim, or rather to the claim as a whole, to establish that the claim is something more than a computer program as such. Cutting to the chase, they need to show the usual non-excluded technical contribution. Now, I accept that on the flip side, if we're wrong and neural networks themselves are not a program for a computer, then the judge was right, and the claim as a whole does not engage the computer program exception. Even if there are other aspects of computer programming in the rest of the claim, which indeed there are. And the only caveat I add to this is if neural networks do not involve a computer program, there's a further point on whether they are a mathematical method, which is the subject of our ground 3, which I'll come back to separately. And picking up the dispute as to whether a neural network itself is a program, it's in our skeleton at paragraph 23. But to a significant extent, I've already covered it because matters have moved on. And as I mentioned, I don't have to find my way around the alleged concession. The problem is that contrary to what Sir Anthony Mann understood, and we've sought to explain, a trained ANN, irrespective of whether it's implemented in hardware or emulated, involves a computation engine, a computer, which is programmed to perform a particular task by instructions, the set of weights and biases, which constitutes a program. And if we're right in this, there is nothing in the claim as a whole which is not a computer program. There's no immediately apparent technical contribution lying outside of the program for a computer exclusion, and the established law for considering precisely whether the as such limitation on the exclusion is met needs to be applied. One has to move on to the Aerotel questions. And in this respect, we say neural networks are nothing special. They're just another aspect of computer programming, and the claim has to be assessed for a non-excluded technical contribution in the well-established way that we all recognise applies with conventional computer programs. And the factual position as to the operation of neural networks and their computational nature is set out in our skeleton as we went through.
Well, you've several times now described this as a question of fact, and I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not at all sure I agree with the respondents that it's the issue of law that they seem to be arguing about either. But at the moment, it seems to me it is an issue of law, and the issue of law is simply stated, what is the meaning of the word computer in the statute?
Yes. And
what is the meaning of the word program in the statute? That's a matter of statutory interpretation. So it is an issue of law, surely.
My Lord is absolutely right on that basis. The oddity in the situation is that although my learned friends raise the factual issue that if-then is not the structure that one finds in neural networks, nowhere in my learned friend's skeleton do I find any contention that as a matter of statutory construction, either Section 1, subsection 2 of the Patents Act or Article 52 of the EPC, the words computer and computer program as they arise should be construed narrowly. That legal point isn't raised. And we say, therefore, once one understands the facts and the ANN is a computer, there is no case before.
But that's not a pure question of fact. It all depends what you mean by the word computer. If the word computer is restricted to an architecture which processes instructions in if-then form, you lose. But if the word computer is interpreted as meaning a machine which processes information, then you win on this point. So it all depends, surely, on the definition of the word computer in the statute.
Speaking for myself, I think you've actually already answered my Lord's question, because you told us earlier on that the definition of a computer was a data processor. And I paraphrase it, but that was your case.
Inputs, mathematical processing, output. That's the definition one finds in the dictionary. And further guidance, I was just turning up the Patents Act itself. My lady and my lords have it have the UK statute implementing or seeking to implement EPC 2000 in tab 28 and EPC 52 in tab 29. This is one of those areas where we are supposed to construe the statute so as closely as possible to be in accordance with the EPC. And I think it's
Section 130, subsection 7.
I'm very grateful. I knew my lord would get there before I did. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but the question remains the same.
The question
which is interpretation of the words computer and program in the EPC. And the problem is the same, which is just as in the Act, the EPC contains no definition.
Exactly. There's no definition in there. We say there's no reason to imply any form of structured computational programming to EPC, either 73, where this originates, 1973 version, or the 2000 version, which is current, where minor amendments were made, including to Article 52, but not in this part of it.
Yeah. And your submission, you haven't put it in these terms, but it's implicit on what you said earlier, is you say we should give this an always speaking interpretation. In other words, we don't interpret the word computer having in mind only the technology that was available in 1973, or indeed only the technology that was available in the year 2000. We interpret the word computer having regard to contemporary technological realities.
And also, I thought we were going to have an exciting submission that in 1973, analog computers were quite common. and they don't have instructions any different from the sorts of things you're talking about in your... but we haven't had all that exciting history.
We skipped over the analog computer's definition in the dictionary because they didn't actually have it here to hand up. But
it's all right. You
don't worry.
Yes.
I'm grateful. But
my point was we didn't do it.
The Lord is absolutely right.
But for your
different
Ms. Edwards-Stewart has the definitions down.
I will hand them up via your clerk.
I also thought we were going to hear exciting stuff about the fact that neural networks existed in the 1950s. We haven't had that either, so let's just keep it out.
I'm grateful, my lord, my lady. So the point is that your lordships, my ladyship, have the point, which is computer was a broad concept in 1973. It was a broad concept in 2000. It remains a broad concept today. There is no constructional basis, and my lord is right, it's a matter of statutory interpretation. There is no basis to suddenly construe computer to mean if then else. And other than implicitly, my learned friends don't raise that as part of their argument. But if they are saying it implicitly, the answer to it is there's no proper basis for dealing with it. And that, in short, is the end of my ground one. Now, that allows me to move very quickly to, I'm actually doing okay on time, to move to my ground three, and this is the mathematical exclusion. And as my lords and my lords will know, my lady may be aware, also excluded under Article 52 and under Section 1, Subsection 2, is mathematical methods as such, the same as such point is there. And the point runs very simply, which is if a neural network isn't a computer, then what is it? And part of my reason for showing you the mathematical architecture earlier this afternoon is it simply is, on our contention, a mathematical method. Both the operating network where the weights and biases are formed. It is just performing an extremely complicated mathematical function. And actually, the process of back propagation training, also a mathematical method. Now, just with ANNs themselves, the comptroller doesn't say that there is an exclusion for all mathematical methods or an exclusion for computer programs. The exception in both cases is the as such. Where the mathematical method comes in this case is that if my learned friends wants to say, look, there is a short stop here, instead of looking at the claim as a whole and applying errors, all I need to do is point at the artificial neural network part of it and say, well, that's not a computer program, so I get out. End of process, end of exclusion. We say at that point, if you look at the neural network in isolation, it's a mathematical method. And my Lord Justice Birss is nodding, and I think you can see where I'm going. This is the classic example where you've got multiple exclusions. And if you're dealing with multiple exclusions, you've got to be satisfied that after you've applied all of them, there's something left over. Another way of looking at it is if my learned friend wants to try and get out by saying the ANN isn't a computer program, what he's really doing is shortcutting the technical contribution, pointing at the ANN and saying this is a technical non-excluded subject matter. Now it is non-excluded for computer program, but it is excluded for mathematical method, so it doesn't get him home. So I'll leave that as a very brief point at the moment.
Could we just have a quick look at what the hearing officer said about this, paragraph 63, because we can see how the argument, how the issue on mathematical method arose in front of him.
Yes. So it's at 63, and what my lord will see there is there's language of the decoupling. I'm not persuaded that the neural network can be decoupled from the software platform that supports it in the way that Mr. Chatsfield suggested. My understanding of this is that what was going on is that the hearing officer was rightly saying, look, the fact that there's a bit of maths in this claim doesn't matter. You can have a bit of maths, and lots of inventions do have a bit of maths in them. But if they sit in the concept of a bigger system, then that's fine. The rest of the system provides the technical contribution. But if you try and pluck the neural network out to say, to decouple it, to say, here's a technical bit, which isn't a computer program, to decouple it, the hearing officer says, I don't think actually pulling the neural network out in this way, decoupling it, is the right thing to do, taking it out of the overall software environment in which it lives. But if you do that, then it's a mathematical method.
I mean, it's fair to say the hearing officer, of course, wasn't confronted with quite the argument that you're dealing with, because it wasn't before the hearing officer that this point about things not being computer programs arose. But you would say, as I understand it, that the logic of Para 63 would still work, even if this wasn't a computer program at all.
Well, quite. As I understand it, the logic still works. And what happened was the argument of pulling out the ANN wasn't being run in front of the hearing officer. There was no appeal by my learned friends to Sir Anthony over this finding in respect of not being able to decouple the ANN. And then over the course of submissions in the hearing, the decoupling the ANN, using it as a get out of the exception, became the case. And when the comptroller in written submissions afterwards said, well, hang on a minute, how about mathematical method? There was a big row about respondents' notice and whether we'd given notice about wanting to raise the mathematical exception because we hadn't understood that the decoupling would take place. Now, thankfully, all of that history is behind us because my learned friend is taking a very sensible view on this. But I do say he's got to be careful not to go back to the decoupling argument, pulling out the ANN, because if he does, he's then got to simultaneously deal with whether or not it's caught instead by the mathematical program exclusion.
As I understand it, Mr. Nicholson, you're not running ground 3 separately from ground 1. If you win on ground 1, ground 3 doesn't apply.
Absolutely not. So
Yeah, it's really there to stop you being outflanked.
exactly. So there it is. I think my lords and my lady understand what it's there for, why it's there, and in brief terms how it works. My learned friend only spends one paragraph, his sort of 110 I think it is, on it in his skeleton. It may be that it doesn't come back. If it does and I need to say something more, I'll say something more in reply.
So is that your ground 3?
Those are my ground 3.
So would this be a convenient moment?
Yes, it would.
So how are we doing time-wise, Mr. Nicholson?
We're doing well. For equal time between my learned friend and I need to be sat down by about, I'm saving some for reply, 30 minutes for reply. I need to be sat down by 11:15. And
Quarter past
11 tomorrow morning, and I'm 3/4 through my note, so I think I'm running about on time.
Right. Do you want to hand up any of the...
You've done it today. One for each of the judges. I'm told by the side, my lady and my lords, that the first 2 pages are Collins, and the 3rd page is... So page 3 is handed up as the one I was seeking to read out, and then you've also got another definition from dictionary.com over on page 4 of this printout.
Thank you very much indeed. Very well. Thank you all. 10:30 tomorrow morning.
All right.